The program for this talk is very informal, as you can probably imagine, and considering I know almost everyone, although not everyone, in different ways. I guess that's small town Georgetown. And I wanted to start by just mentioning, you know, I came home a couple years ago to see Canadian flags on every lawn, and this was like Georgetown won, like the most patriotic town. And I didn't like that a whole lot. That didn't make me feel super great. But to see the orange ribbons on every post all over the town has, you know, like to say, it feels like something's changing, and I understand it's the students at Georgetown High that have been doing this, and to know that Georgetown High went from being, you know, the home of the rebels in the 1980s till today, the students are putting up these ribbons. I think that that's really amazing, and I wanted to mention that to say that, you know, progress is possible and progress is happening, even if progress is slow. And that's a lot what this book is about. And so in that spirit as well, I want to recognize that we're on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. And of course the Huron-Wendat, who then migrated towards where I live today, which is also the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat in Quebec City. So I feel it's interesting to have these very old you know, connections that we have in this country that we often try to forget. I think Canada is always in this constant act of trying to forget its past. I'm not going to read too much from the book, but I am going to start with what I think is kind of like the quintessential millennial kind of way to talk about feminism, which is to millennial Canadian way to talk about feminism, which is to talk about the heritage minutes. Those minutes of history that were on TV when so many of us were young, and we learned Canadian history through that way. And so once I read this, I will talk maybe a little bit more about the book, but not too much, because I know it's all very hot, and then you can all spend time in the tent and be as cool as I am right now. And then you can everybody needs to buy 5 books. That's what I promised the folks at the Knowledge Bookstore. And if you don't know the Knowledge Bookstore, you should, because not only are they the closest independent bookstore to this library, so to Georgetown, but they're also really great. They're really, really wonderful. So their catalog is awesome, and you should check it out. So the book that I wrote is not a history book. I'm not a historian, but I did have to start with history, because I think that when you're talking about feminism in Canada, you have to really have a sense as to what mainstream feminism looked like in this country, and therefore what we are struggling against a lot of times in the feminist movement. And I said I started with the heritage minutes, and so I'm going to read a passage from well, you know, the funny thing about book readings is I'm going to read a passage that if you have started reading the book, you've probably read this, because it's like page 14, right? I should probably read something from page like 200 where no one gets to, right? But I'm going to do page 14, and so if you read this, you'll have to just, you know, ignore me, I guess. So I start by quoting Judy Rebick, who is a you know, famous feminist, and Judy and I happened to know each other just because we were at the same university. We were at the university that we now call X University in downtown Toronto. And so I didn't know her as this like wonderful feminist activist. I knew her as this kind of pain in the ass on committees with me, and we were both pain in the asses together, which was really, we had, you know, kindred spirits with Judy Rebick. I'm sure she'd laugh if she sees this video. Maybe I'll just send her this video and say, this is what I say about you when when I'm in private with my friends, right? But Judy wrote this book called 10,000 Roses, and it's an oral history of the feminist movement in Canada as like told by the people who lived it, and it's a very interesting accounting for feminism from the 1950s right up until the year 2005, when the book ends. And so she says, she sums up the problem with how history of the Canadian women's movement is often told. And so this is Judy's words. So much of what passes for popular knowledge about the women's movement focuses on what was achieved by liberal middle-class women who already had a certain amount of privilege. And we could probably say a certain amount. That was written in 2005. Let's say a lot. That certain amount was a lot. The women did play an important role, but there were many others: radical feminists, Marxists, anarchists, black consciousness militants, Quebec nationalists, union activists, left-wing NDPers, and plain old kick-ass shit disturbers. She wrote, radical uppity women make people in power nervous, so they are disappeared from history wherever possible. Erasing these women, this is my words now, erasing these women from the story of the women's movement in Canada has helped hide the radical action that was required to win so many feminist gains. There are parts of this story that are well known. We know that Canada was formed at a time where women weren't considered persons, and that some women were considered even lower than that. Although I'll mention, women were able to vote actually before Canada was a country. It was once Canada became a country that women were illegally barred from voting. And there's an interesting story of the mother of Louis-Joseph Papineau talking about how she voted for her son. And it was like, what, women could vote? Yes, if they own land, right? If they own land, they could have voted. But that was made illegal in 1867. These prejudices were enshrined in the colonial law, and their impacts continue to persist today. We know what we've learned from the Heritage Minutes. Laura Secord's quote, "Take me to Fitzgibbon," she's lying down, right? "Take me to Fitzgibbon." I like to act these out because they were really, we all, yeah, okay. Emily Murphy's soliloquy, where I, Emily Murphy, and all women after me, persons under the law, with that weird fake British accent. The ode to the one-room school teachers. Both of you know I cannot read a word, right? Remember that guy, the Scottish guy? Yeah. And Jenny Trout, inside her medical school class, walking over to a paper leaf covering the penis of a naked male on a poster, ripping it off and throwing it at a verbally abusive student. Okay, maybe we didn't learn all of that. If any of that was meaningless to you, which of course is meaningless to some people, it's because you didn't grow up between 1991 and 1998 watching too much Canadian television like I did. The first set of Heritage Minutes ran on TV throughout the 1990s and told a version of history that many of us know to be true or believe to be true. Of course, there were omissions. We learned that Laura Secord saved Upper Canada, except who actually saved Upper Canada? Anyone? Anyone? Do you know? Who read my book? Nobody? Okay. Even though it was the Mohawk fighters from Ganawage and the Grand River who defeated the Americans, right? Laura Secord was famous for tipping them off. Okay, but they did the work, right? Emily Murphy may have won the right for some women to be named persons under the law, but she also fought for drug criminalization that specifically targeted immigrants, which forms the basis of Canada's drug policy still to this day. And she was also a proponent of forced sterilization. Murphy was a well-connected daughter of the Orange Order. Her brother and father were both, uncle and brother, both, were both Supreme Court justices, and another uncle was a Conservative MP. And Murphy's victory didn't extend to Indigenous people who would not be able to vote federally until 1960, and Indigenous women who lost their status from marrying non-status Indigenous men wouldn't be able to vote federally until 1985. One-room school teachers were often women, one of the few locations for women to work in Canada, and that clip in the commercials celebrated the bedrock of our education system today as being thanks to young women, except that the education that was taught was extremely narrow and upheld white supremacy. In the Heritage Minute, the teacher's hook to convince her bosses to let her teach is that the teachers are learning how to read the Bible. A reminder that Canada's education system was built to assimilate and exclude students based on religion. Millions of lives were ruined thanks to the colonial curriculum and colonial structures that used religious education to try and eliminate Indigenous people. And Jenny Trout, an immigrant woman who persisted through chronic illness to become Canada's first licensed physician, had to finish her studies in the United States because no Canadian school would accept her as a full-time student. Right? So and that was it. Like, there was not actually other stories of women in these Heritage Minutes. But I start with that because I think it's such an important reminder that the way that we tell history in this country is so present. It's so current, and it helps us to forget, in this constant state of forgetting of what the true origins of Canada are. And when we don't know what the true origins of this country are, we forget, and then we don't struggle against those perpetual oppressions that continue to exist. So the book, as I say, though, is not a history book, and the way that I wrote it was more of a reminder for folks that may have no idea or may have forgotten or maybe are brand new to organizing what it actually takes to build the power that is necessary to withstand attacks from government, maybe from right-wing forces, maybe from business. And to actually build something strong enough to withstand attacks takes a lot. It's not just voting, it's not just organizing, it's not just mobilizing, but it's the combination of all of that. It's the combination of building enough of a relationship with one another that we're able to actually fight and win. And I think that memory for a lot of us just doesn't exist anymore because of something called neoliberalism. And so I write a lot about neoliberalism in the book. It was the transformation of society from a society that was understood as being a community, a collective, right? We're communities of people. And instead we were transformed into individual units. And what that did to feminism is it turned feminists into individual actors or self-identification, where you can say, well, I'm the feminist Prime Minister of Canada, therefore I'm a feminist, right? Never mind the fact that the feminist Prime Minister of Canada, you know, only made available $40 million for shelters to combat gender-based violence. Well, no, to actually mitigate the impact of gender-based violence, right? Because of course gender-based violence then still happens. And so the way that feminism has been transformed under this neoliberal era is that the social services, the social safety net has been annihilated, and the impacts of that are, you know, increased poverty, increased violence against Indigenous women and racialized women especially, decreased violence towards white women on a long 40-year scale, but that there's no real understanding of what's the origins of that, what's the origins of violence, what's the origins of patriarchy. And at the same time, what we once had was this national structure that we're able to bring together feminist activists from all over the political spectrum. You know, everyone from radical Marxists to, like, you know, religious organizations coming together. That fell apart after the big struggle was won, which was, of course, the fight for abortion rights in 1988. And there was an interesting tension at the center of this organization, because there was middle-class white women who got that win, who won that abortion struggle. And a lot of racialized feminists saying, okay, that was important, but what about reproductive justice? What about violence within the medical system? What about the violence that Caribbean women experience as domestic workers in this country, and deportations and the separations of them from their families? And a lot of white middle-class women said, well, that's not our struggle. And the movement collapsed and it never recovered. Right after the first woman was elected president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, Subira Tinani, the first racialized woman was elected, it all collapsed. And in 10,000 Roses, Judy Rebick talks to a lot of folks who say, a lot of white feminists who said, I should have stuck around. I should have worked harder to make Sunera's presidency possible. Because Sunera was also attacked viciously in the House of Commons by members of the Conservative Party who are saying all nasty things about her to discredit her and to discredit the organization. And so you have this racism coming through the feminist movement, and at the same time you also have the attacks on social movement organizing through neoliberalism, cuts to the social, to social welfare and social services, and the services having to then help people more than ever to protect them from the ravages of capitalism. Anyway, so how then do we build a movement that has the strength to be able to withstand power? That requires in-life meeting with one another, which is what we're going to do after I'm finished talking. It requires meeting each other not just online and not just relying on the internet, but actually coming together in real-life spaces where spaces cannot be infiltrated by police, for example, or spaces where we actually can meet at one another and understand each other a little bit better so we can talk to one another, and where we can learn, right? Where knowledge is really, really important. I have a chapter on knowledge and the production of feminist knowledge and why that's really important. And I think I'll just maybe finish by mentioning the importance of debate and having a space for us to have good debate, not the kinds of debates online that you get misinterpreted or you get misunderstood, but the kinds of debates where we can say, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying, I'm going to meet you halfway, we're going to work through our differences, we're going to learn about our differences and go from there. And so I spent 2 whole chapters talking about debate because I think that's a really, really important part of building a movement. So I don't know if anyone had any questions, if they did have a chance to read the book, but it was a lot of hard work. It was a very difficult book to write. And I hope that people can, see it as a little bit of a how-to for why do we organize, how we can organize differently, and why it feels like nothing we do can change the mind of politicians right now. I feel like there's a real impotence among people right now where we feel like we've tried everything and politicians are not listening to us. We just survived a pandemic and politicians are not listening to us. In fact, they're making things worse. We're just living through the same August that we lived through last year. And the reason for that is because we have our social structures, our social movements have been really broken by neoliberalism. And so we have to bring those movements together, get people together. I mean, we do that online right now, and find ways to build our confidence up again so that, a politician doesn't say, well, we can get away with doing this because no one's going to hold us to account. They're not going to confront us. They're not going to meet us in the street. They're not going to walk off the job. They're not going to shut down this economy. They're not going to shut down this town because it's not that important. And we have to show them that it actually is important. It is this important. And for the feminist movement especially, that, you know, after 80 years, 100 years, 120 years of a mainstream feminist movement in this country, there's still any number of ways that we can see that that women, especially Black women, Indigenous women, still are experiencing the worst of the ravages of the state, and we need to fight against that. So I'll end there. As I say, if anyone has any questions, you're very welcome to ask. But I do realize that it's very, very hot where you're all sitting too, so maybe you want to circulate in the shade in this very wonderful tent, and maybe pick up a coffee for all of your friends. So if anyone has a question, you can ask, or I can take off this amazing belt, which is very cool.
Well, I had kind of a question / comment.
Yeah.
You know, I'm an organizer as well within the region, and my organization's pretty new, and we're trying to figure out, you know, going to a non-profit section, or you know, being a charity, or kind of like where to go.
Yeah.
And this was great insight, because it kind of really talks about the constraints that you're put under if you are a non-profit, which I'm experiencing in real life working with other organizers, being like, can you know, swerve off our mandate, or you're more focused on trying to get those funds versus actually getting into the community. So that's kind of like the comment. My question is then, like, what should, you know, new organizers and new activists kind of do that is outside of the colonial structure of a non-profit? How else should we secure, you know, funds for us?
It's super hard, and it's interesting because right now, like, I'm going through that as well in Quebec City, where so I'm part of a group of people that organize around the mosque where the shooting happened in 2017, and I'm like one of the few people who's like, no, we can't become a not-for-profit. It's way too much bureaucracy. We're already stretched thin. Like, it's not going to be possible. But to get money from the politicians that want to donate to us every year, we need to have a status in Quebec. Like, we need to have that, you know, that official recognized status. It is these self-fulfilling prophecies where you're always searching for more money, and then you realize you're putting more time into doing that than to actually doing the organizing. And I write about a lot in the book what's called the not-for-profit industrial complex, right? This process by which people are, you know, sucked into the professionalization of activism, and they're not able to actually orient that activism into the streets. And so I think we have to I think be very honest with, like, what exactly about those structures do we need, right? Is it, a lot of people will say, well, we need charity status to get money, but people have been donating through, you know, through GoFundMe's and Patreons and all this kind of stuff without charitable status. So maybe that's not actually what we need. Maybe well, we need to be able to get these grants from the federal government. It's like, well, not all the grants require that, so maybe that isn't what we need either, you know? And to really, like, interrogate that, rather than, I think that a lot of activists just assume that you need to do it for legitimacy. Because, you know, when you call yourself, like, what I found when we opened a bank account, and they're like, who's your official status? I was just like, here's some signatures and we're called this. And they're like, oh, okay, that's all we needed. And it was a huge surprise, because everyone's like, no, we're going to have to be registered with the provincial government and all this stuff. And we didn't have to be. And so I think that, you know, it's about really deciding what your needs are, and can you address those needs through other ways that, other than, like, going through that professionalized route. Not that it's bad, but it takes a lot away from the primary organizing. And then the other thing of it too is, it's like, you know, I think in English Canada especially, this is not so much the case in Quebec, but there's this, like, desire to make sure that stuff stays that we create. And I think we also need to be open to, like, allowing things to kind of collapse a little more, and that requires less structure. So you have, like, maybe a core group of people, and then you welcome people in every kind of year, every kind of moment that there's a flashpoint, and that's the movement, and that's okay. It's okay that there's only 20 people there that are the core, but because you're always bringing in, like, 80 or 200 when you're doing your big events or whatever, and then through that you hopefully kind of reconfigure your 80 or your 20. And then that requires a lot of solidarity with other groups too. So how are we networking with other groups and making those connections? And then you don't have to be any kind of group for that. You can just be a collective of whatever. And sometimes it's as, like, simple as having a sweet name. But of course, when you start to accept donations, you do have to get a bit more professionalized, and you have to have those kind of transparency mechanisms, which can be really difficult. But yeah, it's a balance, right? It's really tough. Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. Anyone else? All right, well, I'm gonna release you all into the shade then. And yeah, and I'm around, so, like, come and talk and hang out, and thank you so much for coming. Hmm.